listening to what I have been saying, and I hope you can understand some of it. And but I think before I go any further, I would like to find out something from you. Yesterday we looked through those little prisms and we talked a minute about cultural exchange, how difficult it is to understand people from a different world than your own unless you make a big effort to get to know them as human beings and go beyond just what you see visible. So I'm asking you for some information now. I talked to you about the big problems in the United States with our civil justice system, hot coffee, and all the problems that ordinary people have trying to get justice in the courts against big corporations. And I talked to you about the problems we have in our criminal justice system when we have lawyers who do not behave ethically, and sometimes that results in unjust convictions. So now I would like to find out from you, how does it go in Italy? What is the civil justice system here? What are some of your problems? Would you like to share with me? Civil justice or criminal justice? I would like to hear from you. This is not a test. Nobody will be judging your English, but I would like to understand your system better. Okay. What about immigrants in this society? How are immigrants treated by the law? Does it depend on what country you come from? How about those African immigrants I see selling the purses on the street? Are they treated fairly by the law? Nobody knows? You're shaking your head no, but you're not saying it. Yes?
I don't study that, so I actually don't know all of the things no really good. But I see that sometimes there are politics in the streets and they don't really care that there are people selling at least low things. And some other times that there are police in the street and you see those people running and across the street really like crazy. So it means that they know what's going on, but sometimes they can't and they sometimes
So what you're talking about is the law says it's illegal, but only sometimes is it enforced, right? So sometimes you get in trouble for doing something on a Monday, but if you do it on Wednesday, it's fine. Any other issues that you can think of to help me in my education about the Italian system? What are some of the differences in the trial process? I explained our system, the judge is supposed to be neutral. Before the trial starts, the American judge knows nothing about the case. The prosecutor investigates the case with the police. The defense investigates the case on behalf of the defendant. And then they bring it to the court, and the court is learning for the first time in the courtroom what the case is about. That's different from death penalty is something that you here in Italy do not have. You are very advanced compared to the United States in this regard. But in the entire European Union, in fact, it is a requirement. Yeah, the whole council. Only the U.S. and a few other bad places. China, South Africa. So, but in ancient history, if we go back to ancient history, and of course everyone in Napoli is very familiar with ancient history because you live on top of it, right? In ancient history, the killing by the state was very common. And throughout our history, our human history, societies have ordered killing as a punishment for murder and sometimes for other crimes. Even sometimes in ancient history for non-violent crimes. For example, in ancient Egypt, if you practiced magic, that was punished by death. Under Mosaic law, ancient Judaic law, cursing your parents could result in death. So watch out. I think we have all done that at one time in our lives. In ancient Rome, if you made a disturbance in the city at night, or you sang an insulting song, that was possibly punished by death. And how did they kill in the ancient times? Horribly, with torture, boiling in oil, sawing, crucifying, burning at the stake, cutting off your head. We have moved a little bit forward from that. In the English common law that I explained to you was the origins of most of American law, comes from English law. Still, there was execution for 8 different kinds of crimes, not just murder. And in colonial U.S., in the U.S. before we became a separate country from England, we also used hanging, capital punishment, the form of hanging. There were the famous trials in the 1600s and 1632 in Salem, Massachusetts. Some women were believed to be witches, and they were executed. And it was later turned out to be a scandal, but too late for them. Only in the 19th century did many, many, many countries start to move forward from this barbaric system of executions. And that was called the Age of Enlightenment. I'm sure you've studied that. And Italy, again, in the forefront. You all know this guy? Recognize him? Okay, I'm going to say his name, but it's going to be wrong. Cesare Beccaria? Okay, good. Because before I came to Naples, I would have said Beccaria. But he wrote a famous book. Maybe you know about this book? Yeah? Okay. And now the use of capital punishment, as you know, in your country, has been banned since 1889, except for a period of time from 1926 to 1947, when you had a bad system of government here in your country, fascism, and the death penalty was a part of that system of government. Before the unification of Italy in 1860, 65? Yeah, okay. Capital punishment was available and used in almost all of the states of Italy before the unification, except for one. Does anybody know which state? Tuscany. Is that right? Tuscany, yes. Tuscany was ahead of its time. Okay. So here you see your Colosseum, and you recognize it. Does anybody know why it's lit up like this? Well, because this ancient Colosseum, which was the place where barbaric ancient executions took place, has now become a place that displays gold lights for life. It used to be that slaves would be brought to the Colosseum and slaughtered, and people would be sitting there and laughing and having a good time. And now it's a symbol of your country's hatred for capital punishment. And recently, somewhere else in the world ends capital punishment, they light up the Colosseum. And they say the reason is because we are not living only in Italy. We are moving toward a global community, and we should reach a common standard on certain principles, such as human rights. So Italy is a leading voice in the international movement to eliminate executions worldwide. And every time someone saves a life, if a governor in a U.S. state commutes a sentence or frees someone who was on death row, your Coliseum is lit up in solidarity with that. So modern history, we have improved a little bit. Now, 140 different countries have abolished the death penalty. 58 countries still have the death penalty. And in 9 countries, they sometimes use the death penalty, but very rarely, only for the worst of the worst of the worst of crimes. So after World War II, because so many people during World War II in Europe and in America knew about the concentration camps and the murders of innocent civilians and children that happened throughout every place there was a battlefield in World War II. The support for it among ordinary people declined. And people said, enough killing. We're finished with killing. And in the United Kingdom, in England, the death penalty was suspended in 1965 and abolished completely in 1969. In Canada, Spain, and France, the death penalty was abolished a few years later in the 1970s and the early 80s. Then the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden abolished capital punishment for all crimes. And as you well know, all over Europe now, no more death penalty. Since 1976, a majority of European countries have abolished the death penalty. Why do we have the death penalty still in the United States? Why is our country, my country, that so many people think of as standing for principles of freedom and democracy, why does my country still have the death penalty? Okay, can you make it full screen? This is, there's an American lawyer who's no longer with us. His name is William Kunstler. And his daughter, he was a famous lawyer defending, a defense lawyer who defended radicals and defended ordinary criminals. And his daughters made a movie about him called Disturbing the Universe. This is a very short clip to explain why he thinks the United States still uses the death penalty.
Established system is legal, and that word has a powerful psychological impact. It makes people believe that there is an order to life and an order to a system, and that a person that goes through this order and is convicted has gotten all that is due him, and therefore society can turn its conscience off and look to other things and other times. And that's the terrible thing about these past trials, is that they have this aura of legitimacy, this aura of legality. I suspect that better men than the world has known, and more of them, have gone to their death through a legal system than through all the illegalities in the history of man. 6 million people in Europe during the Third Reich? Legal. Sacco, Vanzetti? Quite legal. The Haymarket defendant? Legal. The hundreds of rape trials throughout the South, where black men were condemned to death? All legal. Jesus? Legal. Socrates? Legal. And that is the kaleidoscopic nature of what we live through here and in other places. Because all tyrants learn that it is far better to do this thing through some semblance of legality than to do it without that pretense.
So what is William Kunstler saying there? Can somebody sum that up? What was he telling us? What use does the law serve? It takes something that is morally wrong and makes it seem okay, because we do it under the color of law, under the guise of law, under the semblance of law, as Kunstler said. Do you understand what that means in your country? When you had, during World War II, you had a tyrant running your country, Mussolini, and things happened that were legal, but they were not right. And that's the way I view, and a lot of people view, the death penalty in the United States. It's still legal, but as we say, it just ain't right. There are arguments for the death penalty. And some say it is moral, because in the Bible it tells us an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I'm sure there's a translation of that expression. Okay. And also because philosophers say there's a principle of equality. Retribution is moral, because if you take from me, I take from you. And redemption, to restore the balance of the universe. We need to make it equal. If a life is taken, then we take your life. There's another principle called deterrence. What is the Italian word for deterrence? Okay, so you understand that concept. Prevenzione, right. Okay, the idea that if we have a death penalty and you know about it, you won't kill anybody because you will be afraid to lose your life. And also because of the cost. Finances and economics always play a role in the law. So the idea is it costs too much to imprison somebody for the rest of their life, so we should execute them and save the state some money. Those are some of the arguments why we should have a death penalty. But then there are arguments on the other side, taking the same categories. Morality, well, if you look at the New Testament, they reject the idea of an eye for an eye. And if retribution may be a principle of human activity, right? If you steal from me, I will steal from you. But is it the function of the state to be the one to steal back? Maybe not. And death really eliminates the possibility of retribution, of redemption, I mean. Meaning that if you kill me, I can't become a better person. But if you just lock me up for some time, I have some time to think about what I did, to grow, and I can maybe be a productive person in prison, or if I'm released, maybe I can re-enter society with some new understanding. There is no evidence, many studies have been done in the US and elsewhere. There is no evidence, no proof that the death penalty deters violence. We have the death penalty in the US and we are still an incredibly violent society. So there's no proof that this idea of deterrence actually works. And the cost factor turns out to be not true either. We have studied the death penalty in my state, in California, and we have proven that it is more expensive to have a death penalty trial than it is to have a regular trial. And in California right now, there are more than 700 people on our death row, and each one of them is entitled to a lawyer and a very expensive process of appeals that goes on for 20 years. Just like you were talking about Italian process, it goes on forever. People do not die after they're sentenced to death in California. They very rarely die from an actual execution. Instead, they die of old age or suicide in death row when they are being housed very expensively, because we keep our death row prisoners. It takes more guards, more security, and more systems to house someone on death row than it does to just put them in the regular prison. So, you know, I'm not going to pretend in this discussion today, I'm not going to pretend that I have a neutral view about the death penalty. I am violently opposed to the death penalty. I want to see it end. And I spend some of my time when I'm not teaching working to change the law in the U.S. And I have just come from California's recent election, where I was very glad our President Obama got reelected, but I was very disappointed. We had a chance to end the death penalty in California, and we lost. 53% of the people in California voted, yes, we want to keep the death penalty. 47% voted, we want to end it and change it to life in prison. So another explanation for why we have the death penalty in the United States, I want to move from, starting from what Bill Kunstler told us, the lawyer that you saw on YouTube. There is a famous American professor and activist named Angela Davis, and she has written a book called Abolition Democracy, which is actually, she's written many books, but in this book, Abolition Democracy, she was interviewed about her views to explain why she sees a connection between slavery and the death penalty. So what she says is that prison reproduces forms of racism based on the traces of slavery that still can be discovered within the American criminal justice system. She says there is a clear relationship in this age of global capitalism. Do you know what U.S. prisoners do while they're in prison? They work, but do they get paid a wage like a worker gets on the outside? No. They get paid like something ridiculous, like 10 cents an hour. And so it's a form of slave labor because they can't make a choice to go somewhere else. And that is what we call a prison industrial complex. Excuse me. So what Professor Davis tells us is that there is this direct link between the death penalty and slavery, because all societies consider the death penalty barbaric, but in the U.S., in the southern part of the U.S., when slavery was still the law, legal, as Kunstler says, slaves could be executed for as many as 70 different crimes. Being insubordinate, or treating your master with disrespect, you could be put to death. Now, for white people at the same time, there were not 70 different crimes that you could be put to death for. Whites were subjected to capital punishment only for the most heinous types of murder. So the institution of slavery was a receptacle for the form of punishment that was considered too uncivilized to be inflicted on white people. And after slavery ended, as we discussed the other day, it took us a few years. We didn't end slavery in the United States until 1865, around the same time you were becoming a unified country. And then capital punishment was supposed to be deracialized or colorblind, right, after the end of slavery. But the death penalty in the U.S. still is inflicted disproportionately against African Americans. So more African Americans are executed or sentenced to death than white people in the U.S. So even though the court is supposed to look at every individual as if they have the same human rights, if the color of your skin is dark, that's not the way you're looked at in the courts. It's the way you're supposed to be looked at, but it's not always reality. And according to Professor Davis, if you are in a community of darker skinned people in the U.S., then you are viewed under the law as having fewer rights than those white citizens. And so it makes the racism invisible because we don't acknowledge it, but it still affects us. The death penalty in America is controversial. There are many people who are opposed, like me, and there are yet many people who are in favor of it. And it is divisive. It's a reason for us to fight with each other or argue with each other. It's very political. More Democrats support the end to the death penalty than do Republicans. And it's very racial. Most African Americans, most Latinos, most recent immigrants to the U.S. are against the death penalty. There have been at different times in my country's history movements to end the death penalty. And the U.S. Supreme Court is my hope, because the court recognizes evolving standards of decency. What does that mean? It means that what was considered moral and decent in the time of the ancient Roman Colosseum has changed, at least in most places, and hopefully one day in my country. But also, as you described earlier, between the north and the south of Italy, there's a great difference in the north and the south of my country. Before the Civil War in the U.S., the 1860s, murder and other crimes were punishable by death. After the Civil War, murder was divided into different kinds of murder. So there was... There were different degrees of murder, meaning some murders were viewed as first degree, the worst kind. You plan it ahead of time, you carry it out, perhaps you carry it out by torture. Those kinds of murders, the worst kind. Then there were kinds of murder that were viewed as less terrible. You come home, you find your husband or wife in bed with someone else, you kill them. That's bad, but it's considered less bad than if you plan and plot. So murders committed in the heat of passion are considered of a lesser degree. And sometimes there can be accidental killings. If you don't mean to kill someone, but it happens accidentally. Those kinds of killings are less. So when murder was divided into degrees, it provides discretion. A jury listens to the facts and decides, is this a first-degree murder? If so, death penalty. Is it a second-degree murder? If so, no death penalty. In the South, the death penalty was used as a method to control the slave population, as Angela Davis tells us. And in fact, Bill Kunstler's point about the law, if you make it legal, it's okay. We used to have laws in the United States that said it's perfectly legal to treat slaves one way and other people a different way. In North Carolina, for example, when slavery was still legal, if you tried to help a slave escape, you be punished by death. In Virginia, there were 70 different crimes that were punishable by death if you were black, and only 5 if you were white. In Georgia, if you were found guilty of rape, death if you were African American. If you were white, only a fine and perhaps jail, up to the discretion of the judge. And then after the Civil War, in the early 19th century, the United States entered a period of trying to reform lots of different problems. And as we discussed on Monday, we tried to end alcohol sales. That didn't work so well. We also brought women into the community by permitting women to vote, starting in 1920. And we ended slavery. And we tried to pass some laws that would permit for a better treatment of people in prison, and better treatment of poor people, and better treatment for those who were mentally ill. And more groups began to speak up, seeking an end to the death penalty. The history of the death penalty in America reflects an effort to make administration of the death penalty consistent and fair. When we divided murder into degrees, we were saying it's not fair to execute everyone who kills. We should only reserve the death penalty for those we consider the worst of the worst. Let's try to make it fair. And the U.S. Supreme Court tried many times to come up with some rules that would help us administer the death penalty fairly. These laws, these black codes, permitting a more severe punishment just because of your race, were abolished with the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln, perhaps our greatest president, in 1863, when he freed the slaves, he ended the black codes as well. But you can pass a law, but you cannot always affect racist ideology and end it with the passage of a law. If you have questions or if I'm going too fast, please raise your hand. I'd rather you talk to me so I can. So even though the law says every person is to be treated equally under the law, it's not yet a reality. And we still have this problem of racist ideology infecting our laws like a disease. And one terrible example of that is something called lynching. Lynching was when a group of white people took a black person and hung him from a tree. Not a legal process, but a very common process in the South. It was an extra-legal restoration of the black codes. In the 1890s, so after the Civil War, and after the end of the black codes, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, there were 1,540 lynchings, and most of those were black men. And there were only 1,215 legal executions. So you can see people who were impatient with the process of the law because it took too long would just go to the nearest tree and do their justice that way. Lynching is outside the legal system, but it was tolerated. And in a way, you can say that the fact that the death penalty is legal gave permission for the lynchers to say, okay, forget about it, we'll stop lynching, but we'll just use the law. As Bill Kunstler says, the law provides the aura, the semblance of legality. This is a very disturbing image. This is an image of people, white people, coming out to have a good time and watch two black men be executed. This happened, what year? Can you guess? Can anybody tell me, looking at the clothing or any other clues, what year do you think this happened in? Is this in the 1800s? 1930. You are right. 10,000 white people went to the county jailhouse where 3 black men were accused of raping a white girl. And they took hammers and broke down the jailhouse doors. And this was in Indiana, not even super south, kind of the middle of the country. And the people who were lynched were not only hung from a tree, but they were mutilated. Some of them had their private parts cut off and were displayed for the crowd's enjoyment. Some of these photographs became postcards that people would send to their relatives and say, "This is what I did last weekend." At the same time, these photographs helped us move forward because some people looked at these photographs and became revolted and said, "I don't want to be in a society that tolerates this form of barbarity." So we've talked about some reasons for and against the death penalty, but in the U.S., there was more public support for the death penalty when times got tough. When economic times were hard, it brings out the worst in people. And in the Great Depression of the 20s and the 30s, which, as you know, was a worldwide depression, the United States developed a strong fear that immigrants would come and take away jobs from the people in the U.S. And there was also a great fear of people who were considered radical. And then the numbers of executions that had gone down after the Civil War rose again. During the 30s, there were 1,667 executions, but between the end of World War I, 1918, and 1959, after the post-war boom, there were 4,700 people executed in the U.S. These are some famous Italian Americans, Sacco and Vanzetti. Have you studied this case? Any of you heard about these guys? Bill Kunstler mentioned their names. So in 1920, there was a large community of Italians in the United States. And in Massachusetts, in the north, 2 men were killed, and they were carrying boxes that contained money that was the payroll of a shoe factory. Many immigrants worked in the shoe factory businesses, because Italians make good shoes, right? So 2 men robbed these 2 men and killed them. And those 2 robbers got away with $15,000, which was a lot of money now, but even more in 1920. And they got in a car and drove away. There were eyewitnesses at the scene of this killing, and they described the men as looking Italian. And there were, like I said, a large number of Italian immigrants in that town. So they decided to charge these 2 guys, Bartolomeo Vanzetti and Nicola Sacco. And they didn't have criminal records. And they had alibis. They had proof they were somewhere else. But they were anarchists. They were proud anarchists. They were openly radical. And so it was easy to charge them. Their trial began in 1921, and the main evidence against them was just that each of them was carrying a gun. Well, as you know, in the U.S., a lot of people carry guns, and it's not a crime to carry a gun, but combine the three things: Italian immigrant, anarchist, carrying a gun. Oh, that must be evidence of that they were guilty. So Vanzetti had proof that he was selling fish in a different town. And Sacco had proof that he went to Boston to have his picture taken with his wife at a photography studio. But the witnesses they called to testify about their alibis were Italian immigrants, of course, because if you're an Italian immigrant, who are you going to hang out with? Other Italian immigrants, right? So the prosecution argued to the jury improperly that these people should not be believed because they were all Italians and they were all in a conspiracy together. And also, these two immigrants did not completely understand the English language. This is why it's so important that we should all be bilingual and bicultural. So their judge was very prejudiced against anarchists. He spoke out against anarchists, and he would be angry at the jurors if they showed any sympathy for the political views of these two men. So it was clear from the answers that Vanzetti and Sacco, they testified, but it was clear that they didn't really understand the questions that were being asked of them, so their answers weren't right. So they were executed in 1927. The trial was infected by prejudice. In 1925, before they were executed, someone else confessed that he was the real killer. And he said, I don't even know these guys. Sacco and Vanzetti had nothing to do with it. But he was not believed. And there was an international protest movement, not just here in Italy, but all over the world. People protested the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. Many Americans, many people internationally. Nonetheless, they were executed in 1927, and a crowd of 250,000 people came out to protest the execution. It took 50 more years for my country to recognize its mistake. In 1977, the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, issued a proclamation saying Sacco and Vanzetti's trial was not fair, and they should not have been found guilty, and they should not have been executed, and we are sorry. This was not the only scandal about an execution in America or about the criminal justice system. There's another famous case from those days, from 1932, called the Scottsboro Boys. Have any of you heard about this? 9 young African Americans were accused of raping 2 white girls. It was later shown that there was no rape. These boys were really young men. One of them was 13, but the others were young teenagers. They were riding on a train. A lot of people in the Depression got a free ride on the trains to get from one place to another to look for work. And they were called bums or hobos, but they weren't criminals exactly. They just were looking for a free ride to go from wherever they lived to a bigger city in the hope of finding work. So these 9 young men were all riding in what they called a boxcar. And there were 2 white women on the train. And these white women were probably prostitutes. It's unclear. And they were caught. There was a fight on the train. And police came on the train. And the young women were crying. And the police and the young women decided it would be a good idea to say that these 9 black men raped them. There was no evidence of rape. They were charged with the rape of 2 white girls. And this is how the case, when you read this case in the books, in the law books, it says the defendants are Negroes charged with the rape of 2 white girls. Why is that even worth mentioning if we live in a land of colorblind justice? If we live in a country where it's supposed to be you're equal under the law no matter what the color of your skin, why does the judge feel it necessary to describe the race of the people who are charged and the race of the victims? But this case became a famous case after many years in prison. The court, the United States Supreme Court, ruled that their trials were not fair and made a rule of law that from now on, if you are charged with a death penalty case, charged with a capital crime, you are entitled to the appointment of counsel, to a free lawyer. You might remember that I mentioned a guy named Gideon, and his case was not until 1963. Gideon's case stands for the principle that everyone charged with any serious crime, any felony, is entitled to counsel. But before that, the Scottsboro case stands for the principle that if they're going to try to kill you, if the state is going to try to kill you, you get a free lawyer. And why? Because what happened in the Scottsboro case was, this was happening in the state of Alabama, in the deep south in the U.S. And the judge called these 9 men into court, and he called up every member of the bar, every lawyer in town. And he said, I'm appointing anybody who wants to represent these young men, these boys. No lawyer wanted to represent them. So they didn't have lawyers. They had a drunk guy who came to court and just sat there while their trial went on. They didn't have anybody to help them prepare their defense. So the court held, finally, many years later, their rights were violated because they weren't given the opportunity to find a lawyer, and they were entitled to a lawyer paid by the state since they didn't have any money. And that the judge's actions of appointing anybody but then nobody taking him up on it wasn't the same thing as having an effective lawyer. So they spent anywhere from between 7 years and 17 years in prison. But ultimately they were all freed because it was proven that there were no rapes. So their lives were ruined, but at least they didn't die in prison. Another famous case that was the result of prejudice was the Rosenberg case. These two, a Jewish couple, were accused of spying for Russia. They were just feared, just like the anarchists were feared in the 1920s during the Cold War. Everyone was suspected of being a communist. They were executed for conspiracy to commit espionage. It did turn out, later years have proven, that probably the husband was in fact guilty of committing espionage, but probably the wife knew nothing about it. They were both killed. And when they were executed, that helped start another movement toward abolition in the United States. And famous people like Albert Einstein and Albert Camus, the French philosopher, wrote fervent attacks on the death penalty when this case was in the news. And there was another worldwide case that involved worldwide protests, even here in Italy, and that was a man named Carl Chessman, who was executed in California in 1960. So at the same time that these executions were part of our law, they were not supported by a large part of the population. I'm going to speed up so I can get to the end here. The death penalty law, there have always been lawyers who try to attack our death penalty by saying, you know what, we can't make it fair, so we should just get rid of it. And in this case, which happened in Georgia in 1967, a burglar entered a home. He was an African American. And the homeowner was there and surprised him, so he ran away and shot his gun through the closed door and killed the man whose house it was. So he had an argument. If you were his defense attorney, what would you say? Is it the worst of the worst of the worst? He shot through the closed door. Or maybe his gun just went off. What would you argue if you were defending him? this an intentional crime? You could argue that it was an accident. So, if it's an accident, is it the worst of the worst? Should we kill somebody for this? Well, his trial, his entire trial, lasted 1 day. And the jury thought about it for 1.5 hours. And then they had lunch. They found him guilty. The jury could choose between life in prison and death. After 1.5 hours, they chose death. This was considered uncontrolled discretion. When you give a jury a choice of life or death and you don't give them any guidelines about when you should choose life or when you should choose death, the court said this is a violation of our basic guarantee of fairness. Because the jury would always decide for death if it was a black man who killed a white man. And that's not supposed to be the way it is. So the court, in this case, said we reject capital sentencing when it comes without any standards or regulations. The effect of this case in 1972, when I started law school, that's how long ago that was, led to a temporary end to the death penalty in the U.S. Because the court was basically saying to all the states, if your death penalty laws don't tell the jury how to handle the case, what standards to use to decide to give somebody life or death, and you just let the jury operate on the basis of their own prejudices, especially because there weren't any black people on this jury, only white people in this particular case, that's not fair. So the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972 said, okay, states, no more executions unless you can come up with new laws that are more fair. Well, the problem with that was it caused a backlash. What's the Italian word for backlash? When you do something and it has an effect that's the opposite of what you planned. It's a protest against, the court was saying you can't have the death penalty because it's not fair, and the state said, yes we can, we want the death penalty. We'll just make it fair. So the result was not what the court had predicted. The result was more people, each state came up with a new law designed to fix the problem that was identified by the court in this case. And subsequent cases after 1972 have decided, for example, remember I told you that we have a protection against cruel and unusual punishment in the United States. The 8th Amendment to the Constitution says you can't have a cruel and unusual punishment like torture or beating someone. Well, some lawyers said, how about the death penalty? That's pretty cruel. No, the court said, it's not. It's okay. They did make a change that said you get 2 trials. Whenever you have a death penalty trial now, the first trial is, are you guilty? Did you do the crime? The second trial, should you die or should you live? And at the second trial, evidence can be brought in to show the jury that you are a good person, but you made this mistake, or that you had a bad childhood, or that you have mental limitations, or that you didn't understand what you were doing because you were drunk, something like that. So there's 2 different trials now as part of our death penalty system. So that's perhaps an improvement. But the real question is, can we ever have a fair death penalty when we live in a society where the statistics prove that you're more likely to be convicted of death, get the death sentence if you're black? Also, 122 people have been released from prison because it turns out they were not guilty of the crime at all. They were innocent. So that's another argument again why we shouldn't have the death penalty, because it might turn out some years later that the people we thought were guilty, later evidence can prove them in fact innocent. 17 of those 122 were proven innocent on the basis of DNA, science. And that's going to be my last lecture. Next week we will talk about the Innocence Project and the wrongful convictions in the U.S. and DNA. The problem with DNA, just for today, is that in most cases there is no DNA. Only on CSI or Law and Order do you see DNA in every case. Because in most cases the criminal does not leave his bodily fluids behind at the crime scene. The criminal may just take a gun and kill and run away, and there's no DNA. So we can't expect that DNA will be the solution to our problems. The U.S. population, we have, as of 2010, we had 308 billion people. On death row, we have 3,261 people. 44% of them are white, but 41, almost 42% of them are black. But in the U.S., black people make up only 12% of the population. So you can see that there is a huge overrepresentation of black people on death row. Is that because more of them commit crimes? No. It's because the system is not fair to people of a darker skin. You can see the numbers, and they sort of track the way that our society works. Of the people on death row, most of them are men. There are only 61 women on death row. And the states that have the most black people on death row are in the South. For example, in Louisiana, 70% of the people on death row are African American. So I will leave you with this thought. This is another famous professor in the United States, Anthony Amsterdam. I talked to you about clinical legal education briefly the other day, about how we take our students and give them real cases to work on to help them learn how to become lawyers under the supervision of experienced, wonderful lawyers. Then they learn how to do it the right way. Professor Anthony Amsterdam is the founder of clinical legal education in the United States. He's a professor, I think still at NYU. And he takes his students to work on death penalty cases. Here's what he says. Capital punishment is a dying institution, abandoned in law or in fact throughout most of the civilized world. There will come a time when our children will look back at us in horror and unbelief because of what we did in their names and for their supposed safety. So he sums up how I feel, and he says it better than me. Okay. These are the sources that I used for today's presentation, and this PowerPoint will be posted on your school's website. Questions from you? You know everything. There's no yes.
Have you ever seen or heard about discrimination or racism from the judges when prejudice?
Yes. Yes. When I was a lawyer, I was a trial lawyer, which means that I went to court every day and represented people charged with everything from petty theft to murder. And I saw lots of good judges, but I also saw lots of judges who reflected unconscious bias of our society. I'll give you one example. In an early trial I did a long time ago, in 1976, I was working in an office of black people in a small poverty law office in a poor neighborhood in San Francisco. And I was a very nervous young lawyer, and I was the only woman, white woman in the office. My friends at the office were all black lawyers or white men. And they, one day was my first trial, and I had to give my closing argument, and I was prepared, and I was wearing my new suit, and I was ready to talk to the jury, but I was scared. So my friends from the office decided to come and show their support for me. So they closed the office, they all went to court with me, but I was there already with my client, and in walks the people from my office. So there's 10 black people, 2 white people, and me. And the judge looks at the people coming in the courtroom, and he tells the bailiff, who is the sheriff's deputy or the policeman in the court, he tells him, go get some extra deputies. There's some criminals coming in my court. And I stand up and say, excuse me, Judge, these are the people I work with. And they were dressed in suits. Some of them were lawyers, some of them were secretaries, some were investigators. They didn't look like gangsters, but they were black. And that happened in front of the jury. So I won that case. And I think I won that case because the jury said, we understand that this defendant is charged not just because maybe he's guilty, but because he's African. So yes, you can. And there are a lot of examples, more from the South, but there are examples all throughout the system. That happens in San Francisco. Other questions?
We see that in California the most condemned to the crimes is murder in arte.
I don't understand. Gloria?
Intentional murder.
First degree murder, yes, intentional murder. That is the, we no longer have the death penalty for rape. We only have it for first degree murder. We no longer have the death penalty for robbery, only for murder. And not for second degree murder, first degree murder. Other questions? Well, I want to tell you another thing. Some of you came to talk to me yesterday about my school's programs for international students, and I will be happy to talk to any of you about that. I have some information about the programs. I have some application forms and some information about our different programs, and these are going to be scanned in and posted on your internet as well. But if you want to speak to me, how can they, should I have office hours? Yeah, I can speak to anybody who wants to talk to me now, from now until 11:30. If you want to come to my office.
All'incontro all'ufficio del professore del Sacco a metà del classe.
And also Monday after class as well. We have one more lesson.